Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. James White just put out a broadcast critiquing my debate with Chris Date on the Unbelievable broadcast. And today I want to talk about why James White is, yes, unbelievable.
Because evidently he's got enough supporters that would go, and I like story better than Bible. But those folks are going to be more impressed by story time with Uncle Leighton than they are anything else. So
he uses debate fallacies. So I almost titled this Debate Fallacies 101 because apparently, even though he's a well-renowned debater, he doesn't recognize within himself when he makes these own fallacious types of arguments. For example, one of his favorite arguments, with regard to me at least, is ad hominem. This is a to-the-man kind of argument. It's a personal abuse, personal attack, abusive fallacy, damning the source, name-calling, refutation by caricature. It's against the person. It's against the man. In other words, it has nothing to do with the argument that the person's making. It has to do with the person. So it's, like the description says here, attacking the person making the argument rather than the argument itself, when the attack on the person is completely irrelevant to the argument the person is making. So for example, when he calls me a tall gremlin, or when he calls me creepy because I reply to his broadcast and they happen to be long, because his broadcasts are long and reply broadcasts usually are longer. And 99% of my broadcasts have been in reply to him talking about me. Could I call him creepy since he's the one who's initiated the last two discourses, critiquing my interview with Andy Stanley and then critiquing my debate on Unbelievable? You see, this is an ad hominem. It's about the person rather than the man. And we see him do it quite regularly. For example, when he calls me a one-string banjo, like this.
Professor Flowers is a one-string banjo. And what's a one-string banjo? Well, it's only got one note. Doesn't have much variation. All I see is ding, 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 just one note, ding, 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 and I struggle to want to invest a lot of effort with one-note banjos because I've never had any success at getting one-string banjos to do anything other than play one string.
Now, I've corrected this misnomer by explaining to Dr. White that I created Soteriology101.com to separate that part of my ministry from the rest of my ministry with Texas Baptist. You can go to texasbaptist.org, Youth Evangelism, Christian Apologetics 101.com. I'm an adjunct professor, actually a full professor at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where I teach courses. This is my main Facebook page. I just came back from Hunt Baptist Association, where we did a Hoosier One conference, and I spoke on apologetics. I host debates. I help organize evangelism strategies and ministry events through Texas Baptist and the North American Mission Board, and working with them to host an event here in Texas real soon with with NAM. My life is much bigger than what James White is aware of, and if he's not aware of it, if he doesn't see it, then it must not exist, I guess. But I think an apologist would know better than that. And then in this latest broadcast, he even calls me cowardly. Listen.
I find it cowardly that you will continuously mock. Well, yeah, I must have been sovereignly decreed to do that. When you do not provide anything even close to a meaningful theodicy or doctrine of God's knowledge and relationship to time. If you can sit there and throw out Molinism or this, that's cowardice. That's cowardice. That's all it is.
Now, he makes this claim that I'm cowardly despite the fact, which is demonstrable. In other words, I can show you that I have made an offer to Rich Pierce and to James White to continue our discourse to bring clarity to some of the obvious points of difference in our debate over Romans 9. I've continually made that offer. I have an open letter on email that I have shown on the podcast that he actually replied to, where I make an offer to continue this discussion, yet that has gone unreciprocated, no desire on his part to talk through our differences of opinion or to work through those things, to have a living room type discussion over our differences of opinion. I've welcomed that discussion ever since we've had our debate, but yet have not been taken up on that. Yet I'm the one who's being referred to as cowardly, as if I'm not willing to defend my position. This is also based upon a false claim. The false claim is that Leighton hasn't ever established his philosophical position. Well, one, I don't think you have to establish a philosophical position in order to believe the Bible. I think you can believe the Bible and you can speculate philosophically as to those things that the Bible is silent about. And I have done so in my book. You may remember the name of it. It's called The Potter's Promise. And it was made available to you if you wanted it before the debate, and it's still available to you now if you would like to actually understand our view of the Scriptures in order to actually deal with what we believe. And I referred to back in our original discussions to this exact same thing. Mere Christianity in C.S. Lewis makes the eternal now view of God very clear. He relies heavily on Boethius. Boethius is the author of The Consolation of Philosophy that was written back in the 6th century as a philosopher. It was described as having the single most important influence in the Christianity of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance era, and as the late great work of the classical period. It's cited by Aquinas. It's cited by Dante. It's cited by, in fact, one of my son's favorite writers of The Lord of the Rings with Tolkien. He actually cites Boethius. So just for those who are a big Lord of the Rings fan. And so when I introduced this concept of the eternal view of God, I thought James White would be quite familiar with it because it is one of the most known philosophical worldviews and philosophies out there. But yet here's James White's response when I first brought it up.
Whatever you do with that, I don't know. I'm sorry, Professor Flowers. He's finishing up his PhD. Professor Flowers, but despite all of our conversations, I still don't know what you believe. He says he believes the position of Boethius, C.S. Lewis, and Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so an early medieval philosopher, a Roman Catholic, and an Anglican. Okay, that's going to define Baptist soteriology. Right, all right. I still don't even know what that means.
Well, whose fault is that, Dr. White, that you're not aware of one of the most popular positions held throughout church history? That was expounded upon with the help of C.S. Lewis in my own book, which I guess because you have already deemed me as a one-string banjo that's not worthy of your time or consideration, maybe you haven't actually read, or maybe you haven't actually considered anything outside the echo chamber that you've already surrounded yourself with, thus making you less reliable and maybe unbelievable. So instead of looking at just those fallacies, I think we can see some other common fallacies that White will use. He also uses the red herring quite regularly. This is also known as beside the point or misdirection. For example, the description says, attempting to redirect the argument to another issue to which the person doing the redirecting can better respond. While it's similar to avoiding the issue fallacy, the red herring is a deliberate diversion of the attention with the intention of trying to abandon the original argument. You'll see White do this when he refers to what might be called the no Scotsman fallacy. He keeps talking about, well, you couldn't have been a real Calvinist, or you couldn't have possibly, no Calvinist, former Calvinist would ever ask that question. You obviously were never the kind of Calvinist that we were, those kinds of things. Why? Because instead of answering the argument I just made, he just says, oh, well, no true Calvinist, no true Scotsman would ever make that argument, therefore I don't have to answer the argument. Again, it's a fallacy. Here it is.
Clearly, Leighton doesn't get this because Leighton claims to have been a Calvinist. I have talked with people who worked with Leighton when he claimed to be a Calvinist, and they said, no, he's never, ever had a full understanding whatsoever, never practiced it in that way. His evangelistic methods were never reformed. He may make this claim, but the proof's in the pudding. The proof's in the pudding. Anyway.
Now, whether I really was a Calvinist or his type of Calvinist, because obviously Calvinism is not a monolithic group. I might have been a more Southern Baptist type of Calvinist that upheld a more just basic tulip soteriology and not the harder line Reformed type of Baptist that he is. That's fine, but it's beside the point. It has nothing to do with the argument. It's a refocusing, a misdirection, red herring. Hey, look over here. Don't talk about the argument that Leighton just made. Let's talk about the fact that Leighton wasn't the kind of Calvinist that we are. That's a fallacy. And one of the reasons you shouldn't believe some of the arguments that White is making. If you're basing your arguments on fallacies, they're unsound arguments. And I think we can do better.
According to the bio that was read, you were an elder in a Reformed Baptist church?
No, I was a minister.
A minister, not an elder?
Well, it's not elder-led. It was a congregational-led church.
It could have been a Reformed Baptist then. But my question is this.
It was part of the Founders Conference, Southern Baptist Convention.
Oh, okay.
A third kind of fallacy that Dr. White often employs is the false dilemma. This is the all or nothing or the either or fallacy. Either you believe in sovereignty or you believe that God is just namby-pamby, hand-wringing, can't do anything about it. He's just at a loss for words. He doesn't know what to do. So it's either determinism or a weakling little God that can't do anything. That's a false dilemma. We also see it in this latest broadcast because here's the description of a false dilemma. When only two choices are presented, yet more exist, or the spectrum of possible choices exists between two extremes. This is a false dilemma. And what he'll paint it is, in this particular discourse, is that either Leighton is doing good exegesis or he's just storytelling. It's exegesis versus analogies. See, Leighton will go to these analogies, but he's not doing exegesis. This, again, is just a false dilemma. Dr. White likes analogies too.
What it means to be in relationship with Christ and the nature of that relationship. And he was talking about how God's intention is to refine us. Now, he himself admits, I've talked to him about this, he himself admits that he stole this from somebody else. Almost all good sermon illustrations were stolen from someone other than you didn't make it up yourself. But he was talking about the goldsmith. And he was talking about how the goldsmith refines gold. How does the goldsmith know when the gold has been purified? He said the goldsmith knows when the gold has been purified when he can see his own reflection in the gold.
When you keep that in mind, then you sort of have guardrails to keep you from going off the road. Did any of you see that picture this morning of the, I forget where it was, but the airliner that went off the runway and just hanging on this cliff? Somewhere, I think it was South America, if I recall correctly. But I mean, it literally is just hanging on this cliff with the ocean right below it. And somehow they missed the guardrails. There wasn't, that's a little bit dangerous there. They got everybody out, thankfully.
Now, I could commit the fallacy of false dilemma or false dichotomy with Dr. White as well and say, oh, look, he's telling a story, therefore he doesn't do exegesis. And obviously that is a false dilemma. It's not either exegesis or an analogy. It's I am using an analogy to help explain my exegetical conclusions. This is the same thing he used in our debate back a few years ago. He kept saying Leighton didn't do exegesis on the stage here. He didn't go line by line, read the verse, and then say some things he means about it. And I agreed. I didn't do my exegetical work on the stage. I did my exegetical work in order to prepare for my presentation, which were highlighting the hermeneutical differences between your presuppositions and my presuppositions when coming into Romans 9 with regard to the hardening of Israel, their callous condition, how God can show them mercy when he wants to show them mercy or harden them when he wants to harden them so as to fulfill his purpose and his promise towards the nation of Israel. I explained that. Instead of dealing with those arguments, what James White does is say, oh, look, Leighton told stories and had Plato on the stage. He used analogies, and therefore he must not have done any exegesis in order to come to his conclusion, even though I'd already produced a full line-by-line exegetical commentary on the chapter. And instead of dealing with those arguments, which Emilio Ramos didn't do in his broadcast, Dr. Sean Cole didn't do that in his broadcast, both Calvinistic brothers who confronted my view, and they both started by saying, yeah, I know some people are saying he didn't do exegesis, but we don't agree. We're going to address the arguments that he made. We disagree with his exegesis. We disagree with his conclusions, and we understand that Leighton's going to use stories and analogies to explain his exegetical conclusions, but we're not going to just throw out the baby with the bathwater and just say, well, because he didn't get up on stage, read verses, and talk about what he thinks they mean, therefore he must not have done exegesis. If you go back and watch the tape, you'll see that I put every one of the verses up on the screen. I actually covered more of the verses than Dr. White did in his opener because he spent a lot of time, if you remember, back in Romans chapter 8, more so than I did. He never got to the last 3 verses of Romans chapter 9, which arguably is the commentary from Paul himself on what he was saying. He even says, what shall we say then? And then he gives an explanation of what he means between the different difference between Jew and Gentile and their pursuit of either the law through works, running after the things of the law, versus the Gentiles, corporately speaking, who are attaining it through faith. That my premise was that this is not monergism versus synergism or Arminianism versus Calvinism, but it's faith versus works. It's Abraham pursuing through Hagar and trying to make it happen versus him waiting on the promise through Sarah, which is the very first illustration that Paul introduced in Romans chapter 9, illustrating that it is about faith versus works, not about monergism versus synergism. But instead of addressing that point in the debate, what White does is he falls back on fallacies. He redirects with either ad hominem fallacies, or he redirects with red herrings that don't have anything to do with that point of the discussion, or he uses a false dilemma like this. Either Leighton's doing exegesis or he's using an analogy, and therefore I don't have to answer his analogy because I'll just say he's not doing exegesis in order to get that analogy. If, for example, Justin, I were to tell you that I'm a computer programmer and I created a virtual world online.
See, here we go. Instead of exegesis, what do you get? I'm now going to be God. I'm going to be a computer programmer. And so I'm going to start with the allegories. I'm going to start with the stories rather than going into the text itself.
Look at what he did here on Twitter, for example. He wrote this: I just listened to the first half of the Chris Date and Leighton Flowers program on Unbelievable, JB's program. Wow, talk about one-sided affair and an illustration of God-centered exegetical versus man-centered philosophical, lining this one up for the DL to be sure. Now, notice James White's, again, dilemma here that he's kind of setting up. It's either God-centered exegetical, meaning it's the correct way, or it's the wrong way and it's man-centered and philosophical. Well, can't we all agree that whichever interpretation, whichever exegetical conclusion you come to that is the correct one, whichever one God intended for us to come to, whichever one God wants us to believe, whichever one he inspired is the truth, it is the most philosophically sound, and it's the most theologically sound, and it's centered on exactly what God intended it to be centered on, okay? So this is a tantamount to saying my opponent is wrong because I'm right, or I'm right because he's wrong. It means nothing to make these kinds of just accusations or claims. Plus, what I really wanted to point out is notice he's only listened to the first half, and he only actually talks about the first half. That's important because he makes accusations during the program saying that I'm only using analogies, that I don't give any biblical defense, that I never refer to scriptures and all these other kinds of things.
So far, have we heard anything biblical? Have we heard him go into the text? Because he knew what the texts were going to be beforehand.
And yet my portion of the broadcast is the second half where I'm giving my positive affirmation of my views and showing the burden of proof hasn't been met by my opponent. Because this is where we get to another issue of fallacy, is understanding within argumentation is that the person making the positive affirmation has the burden of proof. Let's look at that. Okay, sometimes this fallacy is shifting the burden of proof. And so here's the description. It's making a claim that needs justification, then demanding that the opponent justifies the opposite of the claim. The burden of proof is a legal and philosophical concept with differences in each domain. In everyday debate, the burden of proof typically lies with the person making the claim. And of course, we know from the debate that the burden of proof was on the person in the affirmative making the claim. And what claim was Chris making? Chris Date makes a claim that God predetermines everything by divine sovereign decree, something that's never spoken of as far as we can find within the pages of Scripture. Now, we are aware of their proof text, and we've gone over their proof text. But lo and behold, we disagree with their conclusions with regard to how they interpret those proof texts. And Chris could have chosen any text to establish his claim. He chose 3 verses to establish this claim: Genesis 24, Genesis 50, and Acts chapter 4. So he's making the claim that God predetermines everything, not just every event, everything. And he even specifies even men's evil desires, their intentions, their pride, their lust, despite the fact that Scripture says elsewhere, as we pointed out in the debate, 1 John 2:16, that the pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world. Even with declarations of God being separated from evil, saying, this didn't even enter my mind for you to kill your children to Molech. And he separates himself from the cause of Judah's sin. He even says he had nothing to do. He did not decree the cause of their sin. And in James, the other passage that I bring out with regard to that no temptation is from the Father, because James is answering that common misnomer of thinking everything is from the Father. So he's separating God as being implicit with the temptation. And of course, out of Ezekiel, the other verse that I reference, that God is making an appeal and is frustrated with people who won't repent and come to him, and calling people to repentance and faith. But the verses that the Calvinist, Chris Date, who I think did a good job, as good as any person could do, defending an indefensible position. And Chris is a friend and a brother, and I consider him to be a friend, and I think he did a good job. I don't think he met the burden of proof here, because he never established from an exegetical commentary that God determines men's pride. God determines men's evil desires. He never meets that burden. Even the Calvinists, both James White and Chris, admit that with regard to Genesis 24. James White, even in this critique, admits he wouldn't have started here because it was more an implicit, not explicit declaration of a didactic text saying this is determinism. So he even confesses this is not determinism is not intended by the author. Well, that's what exegesis is attempting to do. Exegesis is attempting to try to find what is the intention of the author in this text. And even Chris Date and James White confess and admit that the author, by telling the story of Abraham's servant, was not intending to teach or to help people to believe in determinism. So that flows to my side because he hasn't met the burden. The burden is not to demonstrate how God foreknows a bunch of free choices in circumstances. The burden is not to foreknow that God even determines millions of free choices. The burden is to prove that God determines everything, including pride. So even if the story in Genesis 24 could somehow demonstrate that billions of free choices were determined by God, it still wouldn't meet the burden of proof that God determines people's pride. You see the problem? Okay, so even if I were to confess, yes, James White and Chris Date, man, they convince me. Genesis 24 means that God somehow predetermined thousands upon thousands, even millions upon billions of individual free choices. He somehow determined those free choices to happen exactly the way they had to happen in order to make sure that Rebekah was there at that right, perfect time, and everything played itself out just perfectly. It proves without a reasonable doubt to me that by golly, God must have determined all of those choices. It still doesn't meet the burden of proof that God also determines men's pride, despite the fact that the Bible says it's not from God. Okay? That's the problem. He did not meet his burden of proof. He did not find the verse that teaches God determines men's pride. God determines men's sinful desires. He didn't find that verse. He didn't establish that. Therefore, the verse simply doesn't say what the Calvinist needs it to say in order to support divine meticulous determinism of everything. So Genesis 50. James White says that Chris should have started here because it's more of explicit text. But even here, it's a narrative. And this is Joseph giving a critique back to his brothers within the context of their life. He's not, again, you have to ask yourself, what is the intention of the author? Was the intention of Joseph when he's talking to his brothers to teach determinism? I think that James White would also concede that's not what Joseph was trying to say. He wasn't trying to convince his brothers while they're there in their humiliation after being found out for what they did, that he's somehow trying to teach them, hey, God determined your pride to be what it was. God determined for you to be hateful, murderous brothers. No, that's not his point. His point is the very grammatical point that I think Chris finally made within the debate, which I conceded to, by the way. And it's interesting that neither James White or Chris during the debate seemed to recognize that I conceded the grammatical point. I have no problem with saying that God meant that evil event to happen. But just because an evil event was meant to happen by God, devised by God, brought to pass by God in some way, doesn't prove that God also determined the evil desires and intentions of the brothers. And that's the problem. That's why I used, by the way, the police sting analogy, which is mocked, which is dismissed, which is misunderstood, which is nitpicked a bit by James White because he doesn't actually address the point the analogy was intending to make. Instead, he draws conclusions like this.
So, for example, the sting thing. How many police stings fail? Probably the majority. Probably the majority of them fail. When it really goes down well, it's like, yay! But there's many times the police set up a sting, go out, and come back empty-handed. Nothing happened. People got scared off, whatever else it might be. So does that happen with God too?
The point of the analogy was simply to illustrate that even police officers, who are not all knowledgeable like God is, and are not all powerful like God is, but even a police officer, Joe Bob police officer, can even mean an event that is an evil event without being implicit in the cause of the criminal's desires and actions. Right? That's all that analogy is seeking to show. It's seeking to demonstrate how it's possible for even a man, a lowly Jim Bob man, a nobody who hardly knows anything, even he can pull it off. So saying things like, well, even police sting operations fail most of the time. Therefore, God must fail if that's the way He's doing it. That's not the analogy. That's missing the point of the analogy. That's nitpicking the analogy to talk about a point that's not even meant to be described by the analogy. I'm sure guardrails fail quite regularly, but yet you use guardrails as your analogy. Oh, I'm sure anchors fail quite regularly. You used anchors in one of your analogy. You used Star Trek in one of your analogies. You used the gold being refined and the looking into the reflection. I'm sure sometimes that reflection doesn't show up the way it's supposed to. Therefore, that must mean God fails in refining some people. Again, that's not the point of the analogy. And just because you use the analogy doesn't mean you didn't do good exegesis in that text. I actually liked your analogies. I thought they were quite entertaining. Just like you said in that sermon, you remember that analogy because that story sticks with you for 40 some odd years because you remember stories. Could that be the reason that Leighton and your father both like analogies and like stories? Or could that be the reason that Jesus likes them? So instead of assuming a nefarious intent on me, maybe I'm doing exactly the same thing that your father was trying to do, and to help his listeners to understand things by using stories and analogies related to divine things. Jesus used analogies about sheep and about lost coins and about fields, none of which perfectly relate one-to-one to the divine point that he was making. They are to help you to grasp and understand divine truths. And if you've got somebody with nefarious intentions thinking about and trying to nitpick everything that you're saying because you just assume that everything I'm doing is nefarious and sneaky like a snake because you don't like me so much, then I just have to keep pointing back. Okay, if Michael Brown were to say the same thing, would you react that way? Would you do the guilt by association thing over and over and over again like you did with me, trying to make it sound like I'm a part of the Catholic Church like the Pope, like this?
And the higher view, which Leighton thinks he has, is this idea that God basically makes good stuff come out of bad stuff that man creates. Now, there's all sorts of stuff that he doesn't make good come out of, I guess. So there's all sorts of purposeless evil. But then in these specific things that allows him to accomplish salvation in some fashion, or at least make salvation available, that's the big thing that, Leighton's new book is all about the possibility, the provision of salvation, not the actual accomplishment of salvation. It's good that it's out there to say, these are two different sides. One side says God saves, one side says God makes salvation possible. That's always been the divide between the Reformation and Rome. And Leighton has demonstrated he is thoroughly on this subject, on the subject of of provision, possibility, accomplishment, will. He is absolutely with Erasmus against Luther. He is against the Reformation, which he's against Reformed theology. So he is a popeless Catholic when it comes to this issue.
Another fallacy. Guilt by association. Would you do that to Michael Brown? Or do you respect Michael Brown enough to actually address the point of the argument instead of going off into a red herring and trying to do guilt by association? Oh, look, you said something that the Pope said once. Oh, look, you said something that Rome said once. Therefore, you're like that bad character. This is kind of like the ad hominem fallacy. It's really the boogeyman fallacy, that if I can't discredit the person, I can discredit something that the person says that's associated with or similar to something that a bad character said. So if Hitler said something once really bad, then if I can make my political opponent, Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, if I could show that that political figure said something that Hitler said once, then look, that's a boogeyman, and they're saying something Leighton's saying something that's similar to the Pope. And so look at what he's doing. It's again, guilt by association. Fallacy after fallacy after fallacy is what James White rests upon in order to establish his points. And this is why I believe James White is simply unbelievable. He's not reliable because he's not using reliable, strong, logical argumentation in order to establish his points and his perspectives. And I think we can do better. Even Chris, in our discussions back and forth, realized that he didn't understand my position because he thought I was taking the same position as the person he addressed in his book. And once he realized that I had already conceded the grammatical point and that I was actually speaking of the fact that God did mean, he did intend, he did devise that evil event, but that does not prove, therefore, that he somehow decisively or determinatively caused the brothers to be prideful or caused Judas and Pilate to sin. He didn't have to cause them to sin to bring about that evil event, any more so than a police in a sting operation has to cause the criminals to be criminals in order to bring about that event. And once he understood that, he's, I think, shifted his argument or shifted his reply to me. I don't know. I haven't talked to him since then, but we did have some messenger back and forth. And even Chris Date, I think, is intellectually honest enough to recognize the fact that I did concede that point and to now deal with it differently. Now, Acts chapter 4, it's the same principle as in Genesis 50. It's the exact same thing. God means an event, i.e. the crucifixion, and therefore that event is a God thing, okay? So it was a God thing that Joseph got sold into slavery. That's a God thing. It was meant for a redemptive purpose. Well, it's a God thing that Jesus was crucified. So when you look back over time, you're seeing things that God has done in time, right? You can see what God's done. Would James White ever say, man, I wish Jesus would not have been crucified on the cross? Would he ever say that? Of course not. Would he ever say, oh, I wish Joseph wasn't sold into slavery? Would he say that? No. But remember, that's a decree of God. That's what's of God. You would never say, I believe God decreed this to happen, and then say, I wish that didn't happen. You wouldn't say that. Why would you wish against or bemoan or besmirch or denounce something that you believe that God did? And that's exactly what James White does in this discussion, because he says, we don't know what the decree of God is, but we do know only by looking backwards. And so by looking backwards, we know what has been decreed by what takes place, because everything that takes place is according to the decree of God. So was Chris Date becoming an annihilationist decreed by God? Yet, what did you say about that?
And by the way, Flowers, again, I'm sorry to have to repeat this, over and over again, functions upon the idea that we as Christians can somehow know the content of God's decree. We don't know the content of God's decree until we look backwards. We can't see it as we look forward.
So, looking back, we now know that Chris was ordained by God, sovereignly determined by God to become a conditionalist, right?
Chris Date's a conditionalist, and I knew Chris before, I knew of him. I was on his program before Fudge got him off into all of that kind of stuff. And, he runs Rethinking Hell and all that stuff. There have been a lot of conditionalists. There are a lot of people. It's an important issue. I wish Chris hadn't gone that direction and fallen off the rails on that part, but...
So, James White wishes that God's decree was not fulfilled. James White is bemoaning and besmirching and putting down something that he thinks was decreed by God, because he said he can look backwards. Remember, that's what he said. If you look backwards, that's the decree. And so now you look backwards and you see Chris Date was obviously decreed by God to become an annihilationist. Yes, yet you wish it didn't happen. Now, why would you say that about not wishing that Chris Date didn't become an annihilationist? Why would you say that, but not say you wished that Joseph wasn't sold into slavery, or you wished that Christ wasn't crucified? How is it that you can say you don't want something that God decreed sovereignly for his own glory and for his own good? Why would you wish that not to happen? Isn't that talking back to God? Isn't that the very thing that Calvinists often say to us? Don't talk back to God. Don't question God. But every time you question something that the abortionists do, that Planned Parenthood does, anything that they've done in the past, you're saying is decreed sovereignly by God for his glory, and yet you're denouncing it, you're speaking out against it. Why aren't you denouncing and speaking out against Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers? Why aren't you denouncing and speaking out against Pharaoh's hardening for the first Passover? Why aren't you denouncing and speaking out against the crucifixion of Jesus in the same ways? These are events in history that God has purposed and brought to pass, devised for a redemptive good. And God is perfectly just to bring about certain events that may seem, from our perspective, evil and bad, but at the same time we understand, because of divine revelation and because of proper hermeneutics and exegesis, as to what God's purpose was in working within human history with, yes, morally accountable free agents in order to bring about a particular event at a particular time. And again, you never see James White or most Calvinists really deal with the logical issues with regard to saying that God determines every single thing, which would include his determining my not being a determinist. And I know James White thinks I'm just mockingly saying that, but does he give an answer to that question? Well, let's look at that particular point that he makes.
I find it cowardly that you will continuously mock, well, yeah, I must have been sovereignly decreed to do that, when you do not provide anything even close to a meaningful theodicy or doctrine of God's knowledge and relationship to time. If you can sit there and throw out Molinism or this, that's cowardice.
Okay, no, they're called defeaters in debate. That's not cowardly. They're called defeaters. Defeaters are when you offer up other possible philosophical answers that are better than the one that your opponent is offering. So if let's say there's 5 possible philosophical ways in which God might have brought to pass the answering of Abraham's prayer. And determinism is one of them, but Molinism is another. The eternal now view of God is another. Open theism is another. Then you have to decide, okay, which of these possible explanations is the way in which God works within time and space as an eternal being? Well, I take determinism off the table because of what other passages clearly state that seem to, and that's the argument, that seem to contradict the idea that pride comes from God, i.e. through some eternal decree by God. That seems to be something that's not true. Just the same reason I take open theism off the table. It's not that I hate open theists or think they're stupid or dumb or I treat them badly. I have friends who are open theists. I just don't think it aligns with what other passages of Scripture say about God's omniscience. And so I side with either the Boethian model that was already referenced, which is typically what I've landed on, and most traditional Southern Baptists have landed on, as have most theologians throughout church history, by the way. I think it's a fine philosophical idea of God being outside of time, and therefore the I am, he is in the eternal now, and therefore he knows all things because he is in the eternal now, not because he determines all things. You think he knows all things because he determines all things. I think he knows all things because he's God, and he's eternal. I don't know how else to explain that, and I don't think we have to be mean with each other or call each other cowards. I'm the one who's willing to continue this debate in live back and forth with you, and you're not, and I don't know why you would call me cowardly for that. It's unnecessary. It seems like locker room talk, and I think we should be setting a better example for those who are following us and watching us. I know you've given critique of Calvinists in their cage stage acting, badly towards other people, other Christians, and yet you're calling a fellow brother and a doctorate in ministry and a coward on your live program. Come on, bro, lighten up. I mean, let's not do that. By the way, that's in the past, right? So it was decreed by God. You know what was decreed by God by what's in the past, and you're bemoaning and besmirching that which I did in the past. Therefore, you're also bemoaning and smirching what you think God decreed. And yet that's supposed to be consistent theology. That's supposed to be logically coherent. And I'm just saying, sorry, emperor doesn't have any clothes on, brother. He doesn't. To me, that looks like a naked emperor. And I know you like to gaslight me, and if you don't know what gaslighting is, look it up, because I think that's what James White does with me. He tries to make me look like I'm the kid with foil on his head and just this weird old guy that we just don't pay attention to Uncle Leighton over there, just like him tell stories to his buddy, because he's just weird and crazy and kooky. Well, I'm sorry, I unless the people following you are just plain old Kool-Aid drinkers who don't have any cognitive thinking on their own, they're just going to take in whatever you say. I can't imagine that's working with them. Maybe it is. Maybe some of them just love that kind of red meat just to chew on and to tear somebody else up and to talk bad about somebody and to call them cowardly as if you're a bully waiting for somebody on the playground, but you're actually not willing to go onto the playground with them. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a very good Christian way to express ourselves, and I would rather not do that.
That's cowardice. That's all it is. There you go. So are we up to 6 hours now, at least, minimally? I don't think he'll sleep tonight. I don't think so.
I slept just fine.
We have to come to a better conclusion than to impugn. I think, again, unintentionally, I think Chris's view impugns the character of God in that way. And so what we would say...
Now remember, the other side has laid out an exegetical argument. He's gone into the Hebrew. He's talked about verb forms and terminations, suffixes as direct objects, the whole 9 yards. What are we hearing so far?
Well, he only listened to the first half. Remember, that was part of the fallacy that I pointed out earlier. He only listened to the positive presentation from Date's side. He hasn't listened to my arguments and my biblical texts that I pull into question. Plus, on that regard, I didn't want to talk about the narrative any more than he already had. He read the narrative. I have no problem with the narrative of Abraham's servant. Why would I have to exegetically go in and talk about anything different if I agree with exactly what he read and how he read it? We're talking about his claim that God must use determinism in order to bring about the answer to that prayer. Why wouldn't I give a philosophical explanation to a philosophical conclusion that my opponent is bringing? And then in the Joseph story, what more is there? The story's already been read. I agree with his grammatical conclusions about it. So what else is there for me to say about the text except to bring analogies and stories and philosophical arguments that combat the positive claim of my opponent, which is that God must use determinism and God also must determine the brother's pride in order for him to bring about that event. Why wouldn't I bring in analogies and stories to help explain how God might do that other than through divine meticulous determinism? That seems to be a reasonable argument. It's an argument that I think your friend Michael Brown would make, but would you treat him the way you've treated me? Would you call him a coward too? I don't know. Maybe you'd have to get on the boxing gloves again and go at it if you did.
We could get anything like that?
Yeah, I'll give an analogy. For example, police officers create a sting operation where they know of notorious drug dealers in the area. They know their intention. They know that they're evil. And they don't cause, but they use the evil intention of criminals.
For those who are listening by broadcast through the podcast and can't see, he's rolling his eyes, he's yawning, he's like, oh, this kind of thing. Again, just complete disrespect for a fellow brother in Christ. Chris Date does not act like this, okay? Chris Date treats me with respect. He treats those who he debates with respect. And he doesn't have a doctorate degree, but I have more respect for the way in which he does his scholarship than I do for Dr. White in all of his years because of this one particular issue that James White has that I guess nobody close enough to him, Rich, or any of the friends around him can say, brother, hey, man, why don't you just not go that direction? It doesn't help your case. It ends up making you look weaker. So just don't do it that way.
In order to bring about...
Now remember, the text says God intended. The brothers intended. He cannot allow God to intend the same way that man intends. He has to come up with a different way. Now...
Okay, so are you trying to say that God intends in the same way that man intends? That's what you just said. No. Surely you don't think God intends, you don't think God's prideful, do you? Well, no. The brothers are intending to crush their little brother because they're prideful. God's not intending to crush him. God's intending to use him for a redemptive purpose. So obviously they're intending in two different ways, just like the police officer analogy illustrates. And it's only meant to illustrate that particular point, that even Billy Bob Joe can manage to intend an evil event without himself being evil, or without making criminals be criminals, or making them have pride, or determining their pride. If Billy Bob Joe can do it in the police department, then I think God can pull it off too. And that's a point you just never addressed. Instead, you resorted to fallacies.
Again, how many times are stings set up that don't work?
Not
how many
the
times
point of
did
analogy.
God tried?
If the police officers had perfect knowledge and perfect understanding, they would never fail in their sting operations, now would they? So you made my point for me. Thanks.
This before he got it right. Yeah.
The selling of drugs at a particular time on Thursday at 2 o'clock in the warehouse so as to catch all the drug dealers in one place in a sting operation. So the police officers meant that selling of drugs an evil crime for a good reason, while the criminals meant it for a bad reason. So the same crime, the same act is being meant by both the police officers and the criminal.
So why would I have an issue with the grammatical point that Chris make if we both believe that God meant the exact same evil event? If we even believe he devised it, he helped, like a clap in a sting operation, helped devise it. He helped to bring it to pass. He wanted it to happen. He wanted him to be sold. Okay. Does that prove that God determines the brothers to have pride? No. Is that a point that Chris rebutted in the debate? No. Is it a point that James White is now correcting and rebutting now? No.
One is being meant for an evil purpose, for selfish gain. The other is being meant for a good purpose. And in the same way, in this scenario, obviously God meant what the brothers did for a good purpose, for redemption.
God meant it. He meant it, not set up the situation where they might be able to do it. He intended it to save people alive. And on Leighton's position, they might not have acted that way. They were free not to act that way. Libertarianly free, which means if they hadn't, then God would not have been able to save people alive.
Well, then you're denying God's omniscience. He knows for certain what they will do in their given circumstances. That's portions of what Molinism explains. The eternal view of a God would also include within that Molinistic aspects. God knows what they could and would do in those given circumstances because he knows they're prideful, just like a police officer knows the criminals are drug dealers and he knows they're money hungry and he knows if they're given the opportunity, they'll sell the drugs. At least they know with enough certainty to set up a sting operation. God knows with perfect certainty what they would do. And he knows if he were to do it a different way, that they wouldn't have done it that way. And even within the book, and I write this in an article, by the way, at Soteriology 101, the very first article you see there will refer to Genesis 50. And I go through these points one by one, and I go through how God could intend these things but not be implicit in evil. And I also go through the debate and some of the points that weren't highlighted the way that they should have.
Right? See, this is the cowardice in not taking a stand and saying, okay, this is how it works. It's like, well, I don't know. All I know is yours isn't right.
So God's not redeeming his own determination.
So he's calling me a coward for appealing to mystery on the points where the Bible doesn't clearly give us indication on how exactly it works. And I refer to John Lennox, for example, we know that, for example, that God created something from nothing. Now, can you, Dr. White, or anybody else tell us how God created something from nothing? Can you explain how he does it? What's the mechanism? How does he do it? All you would ever say is like any of us would, well, he just spoke and it was. He did. We don't know how he did it. There's no way we know how he did it. So if the Bible doesn't give us the exact dimensions and ways and philosophical understandings of how God created something from nothing, are we to just assume that it couldn't happen? Or do we appeal to the mystery of the fact that God has the ability to do stuff? We just don't understand how he does it. Well, in the same way, we appeal to the mystery of God knowing all things. We don't know how he knows all things, just like we don't know how he creates something from nothing. But we believe that he does because the Bible says that he does. There's nothing wrong with appealing to that mystery. And then once we appeal to that mystery, step into the philosophical speculations and say, it could work like this or it could work like this. I don't think it could work like the determinist says it works because that would be contradicting other texts. And I believe in a logical coherency between the texts that are being questioned here. And I don't think it's logically coherent to say that God sovereignly determines unchangeably the pride of brothers and to say that pride doesn't come from God. And I don't think that those are logically coherent. I think those are A equals not A. I think you're ultimately putting the origin of sin and the authorship of sin onto God, but yet at the same time claiming that God is not the author or approver of transgressions, and He's not it's not from Him. And I think that determinism falls apart logically, and therefore it's not a possible philosophical answer to the divine mysteries of the Scripture.
Here, he's redeeming the brothers' bad determinations. He's bringing a good from the bad. He's not causing the bad so as to just redeem his own determination.
Chris.
So notice there, this is another one of his new, not new things, the things he's been doing for a while now. If there is a sovereign decree, then everything is God's determination. Therefore, he's just redeeming his own determinations. Again, flatten it out.
Now, did he say that's not true? Follow this. This is another one of those red herrings, the flattening it out thing, okay? Red herring is when I try to take it off the argument, take the point off the argument, and focus over here. Don't look at the argument. Because did he say that's not true? Because my determination to be to reject determinism is God's determination. God determined for me to determine to reject determinism, okay? That's just a truism within their view, okay? And so instead of understanding that, and also the point that I just made, that God is now redeeming his own determination, is that untrue on Calvinism? No, it's obviously true. He determined for the brothers to be prideful, and he's redeeming their prideful determinations. He determined for Judas to betray him, and he redeems betrayers. He redeems what he determines on Calvinism. And instead of answering that to say, yeah, that's true, God does redeem his own determinations, just this the way that it works. And he's doing this to demonstrate his glory somehow, some way that's supposed to be more demonstrating of his glory for him to clean up his own mess, to redeem his own determination. And instead of just owning that, what does he do instead? Leighton is flattening it out. Let me ask you this question. Those of you who follow James White, what does that mean? What does it mean? What if I wasn't flattening it out, what would I say differently than God is redeeming his own determinations? Because either that's a truism on your view or it's not. Okay? So if it's a true thing about what you think is true, what your claims are, then you can't say I'm flattening it out. White does this a lot, and we're going to look at that in just a second.
Get rid of man's role in it. Just as Acts chapter 4, you've got Pilate and Herod and the Romans and the
he said, get rid of men's role in it. No, God determined men's role in it, and he's redeeming what he determined their role to be. So there's nothing that I said that says get rid of man's role in it. God determined for the brothers to have pride. God determined for them to want to murder him, and then he restrained their desire to murder him. So he's restraining his own determination on determinism, because if anything comes to pass in the past, remember, if it's in the past, it happened, then God decreed it. So he decreed for them to want to murder. And then according to James White, he restrained them from murdering. So he restrained what? His own determination. So you've got God cleaning up his own mess. You've got God redeeming his own determination. And the best answer he has to that, is Leighton's just flattening it out.
Jews, and they're all acting for different reasons. No. Flatten it all out, and God's just redeeming his own determinations. See, that's how he has to do it. He can't deal with Reformed theology as it is. So
Okay, so if I'm not dealing with it as it is, that means that what I said is not true of Reformed theology. So God's not redeeming his own determinations. So it was not, the sinful thing that happened was not within God's determinative will. And therefore he's not redeeming his own determinations. Is that what you're saying? No, he's not saying that. That's why these are red herrings. It's just fallacy after fallacy. And if you guys just want to adopt logical fallacies, and you want to just say A equals not A, and we're just going to adopt this contradiction, this antinomy, as J.I. Packer says it, and God's responsible for evil, but he's not really responsible for evil. And that's just the way you want to, sell it. Then good luck. But maybe this is the reason that Calvinism has resurged back up and then always dies back out. Over the last 500 years, about 4 times, Calvinism resurges back up, and it doesn't hold water. So what happens? It dies back out. Either that, or God decreed for it to rise back up and to die back out. One or the other.
Flatten it out, and then hope that the people he's talking to, if they're quote-unquote reformed, are malformed in their reformed theology, have never done any reading past basic level stuff, or if they're not Reformed, are not going to go and actually read someone and go, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't quite represent where we're coming from. But exegetically, nada. All you get's the cop story.
Okay, so based upon the first half of the program, where he doesn't hear my side of the presentation, where I bring my own text to bear, he makes these kinds of judgments. And of course, once again, accusation of misrepresentation and the flattening it out, which we've actually seen before, remember?
For the interactivity. You cannot not allow God to say, I'm going to judge you in this realm. I'm still going to accomplish, and in fact, I'm going to bring out of every action my honor and glory. It's all to the glory of my grace. It's all Ephesians 1, et cetera, et cetera. No. That's too complex. We want flatten it out. Everything's on the same level. That's what you've got here. According to Compatibilism, a homosexual's choices are exercised voluntarily, but his desires, temptations, and circumstances that bring about these sexual choices occur through divine determinism. Now, that's so simplistic. That is so robot puppetish. I'm used to that from the old line Southern Baptists that have never given this type of stuff a second thought. Yeah, I'm used to that from them.
Okay, so who is he calling robotic and puppetish? Okay, I want y'all to see this on your own screen, okay? This is monergism.com. See that right there? That's a site he and Phil Johnson actually sent me to in a Twitter exchange back and forth. That's how I learned about monergism.com, was from him and Phil Johnson. Okay, this is their own scholars describing what compatibilism is. And I simply took what compatibilism says about homosexuality. And so I just plugged in, instead of saying human choices right here, this is from their website, I just said the homosexual's choices are exercised voluntarily, but the homosexual desires and circumstances that bring about these choices occur through divine determinism. That's exactly what he just read. And then notice how he described it. So I can't win for losing. I can't even use his own scholars to explain what he means by this diamond orb-shaped, non-flattened out reality. It's just his way of appealing to mystery. Now, he can't just come out and just say, well, we just don't know how it works. Because if he does that and he appeals to mystery, then he can't gaslight me for appealing to the mysteries where there are mysterious things. Where the Bible is silent, we must appeal to mystery. The Deuteronomy 29:29 does apply to some things, like how does God create something from nothing? How does God know all things? And yet creatures are still responsible and free. We don't exactly know how he does those things, but there are some philosophical answers. There are some options, and we can present those options. There are some options that fall short because they bemoan or besmirch the character of God, i.e. determinism. There are some others that may fall short in one aspect or another, but hey, I would much rather appeal to a mystery that brings into question man's capriciousness, like the affirming of libertarian free will, than a philosophical worldview that in any way impugns the character of God or causes people to, like Megan Phelps on the Joe Rogan show, abandon Christianity altogether because they can't see anything but evil when they read Romans 9 from a Calvinistic worldview. I'm sorry, I just think the emperor has no clothes. It's not a logically sound and consistent hermeneutic that the determinist is bringing to the text, and they have no good answer for the charge I've brought, that why has God determined for his children, many of his children, to reject determinism? I haven't heard a good logical answer to that question. I've only heard them laugh it off and say, oh, well, you keep bringing that up. But yeah, I keep bringing it up because you never bring an answer except to say, oh, well, you're flattening it out, which means what? Again, unless he's got a better answer, unless he's got some logically consistent ways to explain how it can be that these things are not from God, that pride is not from God, but yet God sovereignly and unchangeably scripted for a person to have pride, authored it, as even Chris Date put it in the broadcast. He wrote it out like he even used the word author. He even talked about how a person writes a book as the example, as his analogy for what God is doing in our world. How do you not make God implicit within the rapes and the murders and the molestations and all the horrible, horrible things that our theodicy has, I think, a respectable and long-standing answer to, as we've gone over with C.S. Lewis's argument and Ravi Zacharias' argument, William Lane Craig's argument, the Theodicy, the classical Theodicy arguments to explain that in order to have a world where where real love and relationships worth having, you have to have a free world. And the analogy I've used even with kids is to say, if I were to bring you a stuffed animal that looked exactly like a real puppy, I mean, they were exactly alike, and I would offer to them to the children, and I say, now, before you take one, you're welcome to take one or the other. You can choose. But before you take one, just know that this one right here, this stuffed animal right here, it looks just like this other one. And it feels cuddly and good and everything, but it will stay wherever you put it. It won't do anything without your permission and without you directing it, in fact. In fact, if you don't move it, it won't move. It'll be right where you put it. It won't chew up any of your homework or any of your favorite toys, or it won't wet on your carpet. It won't poop everywhere. It will do exactly what you want. Now, this one over here, it's going to do all those things, I can guarantee you. And I'm not just guessing it will. I promise. This is a puppy. The nature of a puppy is to do bad things. It's going to chew up stuff of yours. It's not always going to do what you want it to do. Which one do you want? You know as well as I do what most kids are going to say, I want the real puppy. Why? Because real relationship is worth the risk. It's worth having. And I believe that God has created a real world, not a world of automatons, as C.S. Lewis put it, but a world of free creatures, a world of libertarianly free creatures, of demonstrably, if you want to call it that, as I always say with my friend Jonathan Pritchett, demonstrably free creatures, a recognizably good God with demonstrably free creatures. In other words, creatures that aren't just called free in a sideways sense, but that doesn't mean free at all, but free as in truly free, in a real sense of the word free, meaning you have the option as to whether to accept or reject Christ. You're not condemned for factors that are beyond your control, because that's ultimately what determinism leads to. And that's one of the reasons that I think that we always come to that final conclusion of just saying, we intuitively, deep down, we know this just doesn't sit right with us, because ultimately Calvinism has God condemning most of humanity for reasons beyond their control. And that just does not compute with the biblical revelation. It simply doesn't. It doesn't compete with us intuitively either. We know it's not right to condemn people for things that are not within their control. We know that's intuitively wrong. And the reason we know it's wrong is because God has created us with a conscience to know what's just and unjust. And it's never right to condemn or to mistreat somebody because, for example, the color of their skin. We know racism. We know it's wrong. Why? Because a person doesn't have control of the color of their skin. We want to judge them by what? The content of the character. But what if they have no more control over the content of the character than they do the color of their skin, as in determinism? That's the problem, is that the same reason that we intuitively reject racism, we also should intuitively reject the concept or idea that our God is ultimately condemning us for things that he is in control over, that he is himself determining. And yes, as you even mentioned in your Andy Stanley back and forth with me, yes, I agree with your assessment of our view when you said that being in control is different than controlling. And I remember seeing your face as you were saying those very words, and it's almost as if you realized, yeah, somebody can be in control without choosing to meticulously control everything. You can have dominion or control over a world, but choose to give certain creatures within that world a level of dominion or control, principalities and rulers within this world. And that God can choose in his sovereignty to allow for freedom. Has James White, without using fallacies, answered the questions of that debate? No. Has he dealt with the three texts that I brought up? Did he even express an interest in dealing with the three texts I brought up? No, maybe he will. He's the kind of guy that might. Is he willing to address these things in person? Because my invitation stands to have a back and forth conversation with him over our differences of opinion. Maybe I'm too cowardly for him. Maybe he needs somebody that's a lot braver than me. I don't know, but maybe we'll find out. We'll see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending our online university classroom. Remember, this is a listener-supported ministry, so please consider becoming a patron of the podcast by donating online. Join our team and help spread the word. For more resources, books, and articles from Professor Flowers, or to learn how you can support this ministry, please visit www.soteriology101.com.